You're watching Notepad. I'm your host, Ibrahim Sani. The focus, of course, is on trying to see how we can improve our public finances. This is a long-standing issue when it comes to Malaysia, on trying to make our public accounting a little bit more transparent, a little bit more up-to-date, and most importantly, reflecting the true and fair situation that we have right now. More so because the budget season is coming up very soon. The pandemic management has used up billions of ringgit, and the public needs to know how we can improve on all this, particularly when it comes to this being our own money. Joining us for this evening is Ian Ball, Professor of Public Financial Management, Victoria University Wellington in New Zealand. He's dialing in from Auckland. One of the bigger reasons why we wanted to get you on is because you quite literally revolutionized how New Zealand approach your nation's public finances. From legislating laws that allow for accrual accounting to take place, to making sure that the balance sheet is of course reflective of what is needed and what is being used at any present moment in time for the government of New Zealand. My question to you is on, back in the late 80s or early 90s, this wasn't much of the item that would be debated in the public consciousness when it comes to public finances. But what precipitated this need for change and the need for reflection of true accounting in New Zealand back in the day, Ian?
Well, thanks for having me on the program. It's a pleasure to be with you. It is a while ago now that New Zealand did those reforms. As you say, it's about 3 decades ago. At the time, New Zealand had just come through a period of pretty radical economic restructuring. We had gone from an economy that was very heavily regulated to one that was amongst the least regulated globally. So up there with Hong Kong and Singapore in terms of economic freedom and ease of doing business. And the reforms to the government's finances really came towards the end of that process. And what the ministers of the day were trying to do was simply to get improved performance out of the public sector. They'd seen the possibility of improving performance throughout the economy as a whole, and they saw no reason really to exempt the public sector from that. So a key point in what we were trying to do was to design a financial management system that really supported better performance from the government. And I guess with 30 years of experience of that now, we can look back and we can see a few things. First, we can see that in terms of the government's fiscal position, it's worked really well. After 2 decades of deficit, what we saw was a period through to the global financial crisis where the government's net worth increased pretty much every year. And then after the financial crisis, it declined. Well, it declined during the crisis for 4 years, but then recovered and was in a very sound state before COVID struck. So from that perspective, it's worked pretty well. And from another aspect, I guess you could say, it's largely the same system in place now. Over 30 years, the key elements of the system, particularly the financial components of the system, remain pretty much exactly as they were. So it's stood the test of time. And just to say a little bit more about that, at this point, there is no talk in New Zealand. There's no suggestion that we would want to move back towards a cash-based system of accounting and appropriating and budgeting. The system here is based on accrual numbers through the whole system, whether it's the budget, the appropriations, the annual report, or indeed the monthly financial reports that the government puts out.
In Malaysia, it's very tough for us to continue on with our economic stimulus packages. And the same can be said about nations across Southeast Asia as well. The light at the end of the tunnel is that many of these nations that I just spoke about is trying to reform their public sector accounting, their public sector financial management. It's slow, but of course the need for it is increasing, and folks like me who might not want to normally talk about public sector accounting is now forced to talk about it because it affects everything, not just the public well-being of the people, but the long-term running of the country outright. Do you feel that in developing these kind of reforms 3 decades ago, these were the kind of considerations that were put in place? Did you expect a pandemic, for instance, to hit the world? And do you expect New Zealand to get out of this early or head on from your peers? What were the considerations that were put in place, in ensuring the robustness of it all? And was it easy to get it through to lawmakers and creating laws? Was it all that hard, or was it there's a lot of coaxing and a lot of public debate that needs to take place before we can institutionalize these kind of changes?
Well, in certain respects, it wasn't as difficult as I think it is in many other jurisdictions. There's perhaps a number of reasons for that. I mean, including the fact that New Zealand has a single level of government. We don't have an upper house. We don't have a written constitution. So we could do things the government can do things very quickly if it wished to. And on this occasion, it did wish to. Now, it wasn't really done in anticipation of a pandemic in 30 years' time, but it was done in anticipation of the fact that we had suffered economic shocks in the past. We expected to suffer economic shocks in the future. And indeed, even in the last 10 years, we've had a couple of major earthquakes, plus the global financial crisis, and now COVID. So we can be reasonably confident that, like other governments, we're going to have shocks reasonably frequently, and we wanted to be in a position where, first of all, the government could be agile and perform well in responding to those shocks. But as our Prime Minister and Minister of Finance have both said in relation to the COVID response, having a strong balance sheet is a really good place to start. You can, as the government put it in relation to COVID, they could go early and they could go hard in their response, knowing that they had the financial strength to carry that out. I wouldn't place too much emphasis on this, but it's really interesting to see that in the monthly financial statements for the 11 months up to the end of May, that's just a month or two ago, the financial statements show that this year, to the end of June, the government looks like running a pretty healthy surplus in its operating balance. Now, it suffered a deficit last year with COVID, but it seems to have recovered really very quickly. I think the strong position going into a crisis is one of the things that enables you to come out of it more quickly. But you mentioned it as a long-term exercise. It really wasn't that long a term exercise in New Zealand. So for individual government departments, the Act was passed in 1989. They had 2 years, and only 2 years, to get their act together, so to speak, and have an accrual-based system in place. And in fact, all of them did it within 18 months. And so we could produce the first set of accrual-based financial statements about 2.5 years after the Act was passed. And then we did sequence it so that we did that at a reporting level. And then in 1994, so that was 5 years later, the government then produced its first budget on an accrual basis. And from then on, it's been accrual budgeting, appropriations and reporting continuously. And that's just the way now that we do business. It's the way. You wouldn't think there was really an alternative to doing that.
That's right.
It certainly gives a set of information to decision makers that reflects the real fiscal position of the government and its complexity. I mean, a government's balance sheet is pretty complex. It's not straightforward, and you need to know what your liabilities are, not just your debt, but your other liabilities. You need to know what the assets are that you've got on your balance sheet and what's happening to the value of those. And you can't manage your fiscal position well without that information.
I think a lot of governments nearly all the governments would agree with your view here. The issue is on implementing change, institutionalizing those changes, making sure that the switch takes place in an orderly fashion, in a time that is acceptable by most. And you're right, New Zealand is a little bit easier in that sense. But for a nation like Malaysia, for instance, we have the upper and lower house, we have state governments from varying coalitions. It's just going to be a political gridlock to make it work here. But the upside is there, and I'm not too sure why there would be some opposition to this, because it doesn't affect most political parties directly, but there seems to be still a hold up there. And I'm not expecting to comment on that intricacies that is happening. But
well, I won't comment on Malaysia, but I would just comment that when the legislation was brought into the House in New Zealand, it had the approval of both sides of the House. So there was no opposition to it. Both the Labour Party and the National Party were supportive of it. So that was a very strong signal to the public service, if you like, that this was something that both parties supported. So they may as well get on board and make it happen.
Right. The law that you spoke about was the New Zealand's Public Finance Act. Could you share some of the salient points that is contained within that law, and to ensure that these reforms are perhaps being, if it's good enough, let's copy them altogether. What would be some of the ideas that was institutionalized inside the Public Finance Act?
Okay, well, I wouldn't necessarily want to argue that everybody should copy the legislation.
If it's good, why not, right?
But so some of the things that were in the Act that I think are really important. Perhaps most importantly, we tried to design a financial management system that did actually operate as a system. So the various components were coherent with one another. And so the fiscal objectives that are specified in the principles of responsible fiscal management in New Zealand are accrual-based concepts like net worth, like revenues and expenses rather than cash flows. So the objectives are expressed in accrual terms. The budget is a set of forecast financial statements in accrual terms. The monthly reporting is in accrual. So the whole system is fully specified in the Act on an accrual basis, so that you have legislative backing for the various components, and those various components support one another. So you can do a budget actual comparison with the same concept sitting behind the budget numbers and the reporting numbers. And I mean, in looking at what other countries have done in moving towards an accrual framework, what about half of the OECD countries have done is move to accrual reporting, but remain on cash budgeting. And from my perspective, that creates real issues. In a government, the budget is the big event. That's when the government's finances are really out there. And if those numbers are cash numbers, then whatever you put in your financial statements at the end of the year might be kind of interesting after the event, but they're not really going to be, they're not going to be driving the system. So, you end up in this awkward position where managers within the government will be operating on a cash basis all year, and then at the end of the year, you've got to turn around and produce accrual-based financial statements, which you're not going to use for management purposes, and are really primarily good for giving some transparency to the state of the government's balance sheet and revenues and expenses. So if there was one word that I would use for what you want to have in legislation, it's that it should be integrated. The various pieces of the system should tie together.
Ian, let's go through quite a short view of what you think is currently happening around the globe when it comes to public sector accounting. Do you feel that the revolution is here and is to stay? Do you feel that some nations have an edge over others? What about developed nations versus third world nations? Do you think that those kind of disparity is still ongoing. Just give us a global landscape of how things are when it comes to public finance across all these nations.
Well, I think globally there is a really significant shift towards accrual-based reporting in the first instance, and I think that's a good thing. At least it gives citizens a chance to see what the fiscal position of their government is, what their assets and liabilities are. So I think at a very general level, we see, for example, that amongst the OECD countries now, something like 70-80% are using accrual reporting and about 20-25% using accrual budgeting. What I think we can see is that there are capacity issues which are greater for some countries than others. Basically, no government that's operating a cash-based system will have the accounting expertise to move immediately to accrual accounting. So it means there are a number of ways you can go. You can try and train people internally to get to that point that you can implement these changes. That's harder in jurisdictions which have very few professional accountants. But if you've got them, then accrual accounting is not that different in the public sector to the private sector. And certainly what we did in New Zealand was we recruited a lot of people into the public sector from the private sector to initially set up the accounting systems and make them work. So having that capacity to bring those people in and having the resources to do it is really important to making this happen. But the other thing that I think sits alongside that is a political will and an understanding that government finances are complex and you need to understand them well. You need to have an accounting system that conveys them well to decision makers. And so you've got to have, in the Ministry of Finance, you've got to have people who are committed to this and see the value in it. And I think frequently that's lacking. So I think we're making great progress in reporting. A recent survey came out from the International Federation of Accountants and the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy in the UK, which showed that, there's now a very high proportion of countries that are either using accrual reporting or are moving in that direction. It's well over 50% of governments globally now. So I think there's a global recognition that this is the way to go. It's just a matter of the implementation process and how quickly governments can do it. I might also say that the ideas underpinning accrual accounting are really not different to the ideas underpinning the way economists look at fiscal position. They too would think about stocks and flows and what's the balance sheet. So there's nothing really unusual or radical about this. It's how most of the global economy works on this basis. And in a way you could say it's only governments in a few countries or a decreasing number of countries that don't operate on this basis now.
That's
so
right.
There is a big shift.
What would be some of the ideas that you think can be done to further improve public accounting? Maybe something that could be seen 20, 30 years from now, something that could be better from accrual accounting, some ideas that perhaps even New Zealand is looking at right now.
The global economy has changed dramatically in the period since the Public Finance Act was passed. And around the time the Act was passed, most of the assets that all entities, whether they were companies or public sector entities, most of the assets that they invested in were physical assets or financial assets. Increasingly those assets are intangible assets.
Yeah.
And we can see, if you just look at what proportion of the value of S&P 500 companies is on their balance sheet, if you go back to, say, 1975, about 85% of the value of companies was on their balance sheet. Now it's about 15%. So the balance sheet is becoming, I hesitate to say this as an accountant, but the balance sheet is becoming a little bit irrelevant to what really creates value in companies. And so one of the things that is being discussed in various places around the world is, well, how should we deal with that? Should we deal with it by adding a lot of information to the information currently in the financial statements, or should we rethink what is the test for capitalising some expenditure? Should we be putting some of those intangible assets on the balance sheet? And I think that's one of the really big challenges that we face in the next decade or two. We've got to a point where company balance sheets don't reflect the economic reality of the company in certain major respects, particularly in how they convey intangible assets.
That's right. I mean, I couldn't agree more with you. Earlier this morning, I was talking to my team. We were looking at the P ratio of Amazon versus Alibaba. Amazon's trading at 60 times, Alibaba 20 times. We don't even understand what drives these kind of valuations. And and why we choose these two companies is because we at least understand that they're selling something. I mean, it's an e-commerce business. And then you move on to, Airbnb, Uber or Didi in China, and you start to wonder, these companies are valued into the billions and they don't have any assets, they don't have any inventories. What were the considerations that got into these kind of valuations? And then I don't know whether you can transplant this into governments and how they do this in public sector accounting. It must be very challenging, and to some extent it will be arbitrary from government to government, and then you have accountants from one country to another looking at each other trying to decipher what were the assumptions made. It will be a headache, don't you think? Is there any way to resolve this?
Well, there's no question it will be a headache, but I think we at least have one painkiller available to us, and that is the International Public Sector Accounting Standards. So we already have a set of global standards for public sector accounting. And one of the real values of that is that if governments are willing to say, we will adopt those standards and basically step back from writing their own rules, then we'll be able to compare how different countries are performing, and that standardization process will encourage consistent treatment of items. And I think what we will find it difficult. I mean, it's a big shift in accounting to even think about what some of this might involve. But I mean, when I was a kid and studying accounting, one of the things that they taught us at the time was about human resource accounting, and it explained how you might invest, for example, in retraining pilots who are moving from one type of aircraft to another. Now, that's clearly an investment that's going to generate returns over the coming period. We still don't put those sorts of investments on the balance sheet, and yet, you could argue there's a very good case for at least considering doing that. Now, you might move from that to, well, is training teachers an investment or an expense? So I think there's a lot of issues in here which have to be debated, and we have to find, ideally, globally, a solution to them. But I do think we have to start thinking a bit differently about what are assets, because all around the world, companies are investing in things to generate returns in the future. And as accountants, we're saying we're going to expense those. They're not really creating an asset. So we have to somehow better reflect what is driving corporate and governmental decisions in the way we account. I might just say, having said all that, Ibrahim, the way we do it with accrual accounting might not be where we want to be right now, but it's certainly better than operating on a cash basis.
No, absolutely. That point, I couldn't agree more. Final question, Ian. The pandemic has really pushed all of us to rethink about how we bring accountability to governments. In Malaysia, it seems like there is a growing call for concern for how the government of the day runs its business. But essentially, it's all about trying to get the best administration to help us out in this dire times. Do you feel that there is a growing concern for everyone to demand for better accountability from their own governments moving forward? Do you think that this pandemic really opened up a lot of eyes into how we deal with crisis, emergency, health management, all this? I think it no longer is on the back burner. Everything is thrusted to the front. Do you think that now is the time for us to demand for greater change? And everybody knows that the change is needed and what the change is needed, but nobody seems to be wanting to pull the trigger on it. Do you think that this is a good opportunity for us to use this time?
Well, I think it is, but I have to tell you, I also thought the sovereign debt crisis in Europe was a similar kind of opportunity. The crisis that was actually triggered by poor financial reporting in the case of a government, and somehow that didn't quite do it either. I do think that what is different here, though, is that the pandemic has put the fiscal positions of so many governments into a really difficult state. And going forward, I think they're going to have to be looking a lot harder for ways to improve their performance. And good financial information is clearly going to be a part of that. I do think there are other dimensions to it, though. And I was reading an article or an interview with the Secretary of the New Zealand Treasury yesterday, and she made the comment that since 2019, trust in the New Zealand government has risen by about 18%, whereas globally,
yeah, of course,
the effect has been exactly the opposite. And she was talking in that about the importance of transparency of what government does in generating trust and confidence on the part of citizens and willingness to go along with government. And really, so I think that the important elements are transparency, which generates trust, but also competence. I mean, it's letting professional management do professional work, and knowing where you want the politics and where you want the professional management. So again, maybe just to give you one example, the New Zealand government now has a super fund, which is a sovereign wealth fund. And that is kind of double insulated from political influence. And its performance over quite a sustained period has been really good. I mean, good by the comparatives of other sovereign wealth funds or its own measures. And a lot of that too is built on really high levels of transparency, so that people can see what's being done, they can understand what's being done, and they can therefore have confidence in both if you like, the government will act in the interests of the citizens, but it will also be competent in the way that it does that. So I think this could be a watershed. I hope that it will be, because I think the costs of poor financial management globally are huge.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Ian. That was Ian Ball, the Professor of Public Financial Management at Victoria University Wellington, dialing in from Auckland, New Zealand. If you've missed any part of this interview, just head on to astroawani.com, look for Notepad over there. And you can also watch these kind of interviews on your mobile devices. Just download the Astro AWANI app, wherever you get the application. Until then, thanks very much for watching, and goodbye.